My name is Ariana Hernandez, and I am a professor of communication at UC San Diego. That's me there. Last May, I took my students to the Mount Soledad War Memorial in La Jolla to see this, the cross, that is at the center of a debate about the separation of church and state here in San Diego. A federal court recently instructed the city of San Diego to remove the cross from its public land, or be fined $5,000 a day after August 1st. Though San Diego residents have voted in favor of keeping the cross on Mount Soledad, that did not change the court's decision. Now city officials are reviewing their remaining legal options, and if no resolution can be found, the cross will soon be removed. In this class on the relation between church and state, I ask my students to examine the arguments presented by both sides on whether this cross, as it's placed here, violates the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. What follows are excerpts from the debate staged by my students and two attorneys involved in this litigation in my UCSD classroom.
So Mount Soledad represents multiple sentiments for various groups of people around San Diego. It is a religious symbol of the Christian faith for some, and for others it is a dedication to the memory of fallen soldiers. And yet to others it is a controversial site where it is deemed the cross must go. But who's to say it is unconstitutional? The cross's constitutionality is based solely upon one interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. According to the First Amendment, the government is not allowed to respect any religion. That is to say, it cannot show any preference to one religion. However, if this is looked into further, it is also meaning that the government cannot discriminate against a religion. Taking the cross down could be seen as a move against a religion, therefore a clear violation of the Constitution. In favor of keeping the cross at its original location, we suggest that a more social and cultural perspective be considered. We should regard this issue as one having a rich historical basis and steer away from the state's intolerance of religious association. If we are to keep, for instance, "In God We Trust" on our national currency, what difference does it make if the cross is moved 50 yards, much less 1,000 yards over? Moving the cross from public to private land is irrelevant and not the matter at hand. The real problem seems to be the issue of visibility. One of the arguments brought upon the Mount Soledad Church is the fact that every day, hundreds of thousands of people are exposed to the memorial as they drive down the I-5 freeway and go visit the park. Moving the cross to Mount Soledad Presbyterian Church does not satisfy this problem, as it can still be seen from the park and from the freeway. If we are to be concerned over every instance of religion on public land, we must also consider issues such as the ringing of church bells, which can be heard for miles over private and public land. Obviously, this is a very awkward situation because as public land shrinks and private land ownership increases, we will have further opportunity to be surrounded by religious symbols. In turn, we must also consider images such as that of the Taliban destroying the tallest known Buddhist monuments in the world in Afghanistan just prior to the Iraq War. The world considered this move highly barbaric. Why would anyone possibly want to demolish monuments that not only held religious, but historical and architectural value as well? In the same way, we must see the cross at the Mount Soledad War Memorial as a monument that holds more than just religious value. It has, since 1954, been used to memorialize the fallen U.S. soldiers of the Korean War. The cross is an international symbol of sacrifice in more context than that of just religious institutions. A simple white cross stands above the graves of unnamed soldiers in American military cemeteries throughout the world. Examples of World War II American military cemeteries using the cross in place of a tombstone are located throughout France and Belgium. Therefore, it's plain to see that the Mount Soledad War Memorial is not the only example of the American use of crosses to memorialize dead soldiers. Also, it displays the worldwide view of the cross as more than just a Christian icon. Take also, for example, communist Cuba, where the strict dictatorship still allows crosses created in honor of Christopher Columbus to stay erect, and for historical buildings with crosses engraved in them to remain standing. Granted, Mount Soledad's cross does not contain nearly as much history as Christopher Columbus. Does it still not hold historical value for the citizens of San Diego? And if a communist country allows crosses to remain as part of history and tradition, should not the United States, the world's premier democracy, let a simple cross, a memorial for fallen soldiers of a war, to remain? Some might argue that this cross cannot possibly be a war memorial, for it only recognizes the sacrifices made by Christian soldiers. In this we must disagree. The plaques there placed by the families of the soldiers are not only from Christian families. If one were to peruse these plaques, it would be plain to see that some are engraved with the Jewish Star of David. Clearly, Mount Soledad War Memorial does not exclude, nor does it encourage one single religion. Instead, it embraces the presence of other religious symbols and allows them to be displayed alongside the cross. Times have changed. Our interpretation of what the separation of church and state entails, as is detailed in the Constitution, has changed. The cross has traversed through it all and taken on changes of its own. As we have argued, it has taken on more than just religious symbolism in this present day and age, despite the fact that this may not have been the case when it was first constructed. Such origins, however, don't diminish the present so much as they simply depict the past. The cross itself represents a part of history and should thus be preserved as a part of the memorial on which it was constructed, not to promote Christianity, but to promote a remembrance of the past. Bringing down the cross is much like a vain attempt at rewriting history books so as to satisfy its modern ideals of political correctness. The controversy between those who support the cross and those who oppose it is merely the tip of the iceberg in a wider debate of the secularization of our political and institutional systems. The cross itself, we argue, is a monument to the past as well as to this conflict, and belongs to history, to this memorial, and to the ongoing questioning of our politics as it is critical to our development. What if we were to go further into this argument to apply to all religious symbols in San Diego? Then, as such, we must remove the pentagram at Presidio Park, left from the ruins of a tower constructed in the 1950s to replicate the way buildings looked during the 16th and 17th century, when Spanish soldiers and priests occupied the area. Although merely a decorative symbol, its meaning has been appropriated by the local Satanists and pagans who hold services and rituals at the pentagram. We can then also look at the Yokohama Friendship Bell at Shelter Island. Presented to San Diego in 1958 by the citizens of Yokohama, Japan, as a means to commemorate the friendship established between the United States and Japan after World War II, it is a traditional Buddhist bell rung at the outside of every new year to speed along the going out of the old year. It is still rung every year and is a Buddhist tradition, therefore making it a religious ceremony. Based upon the fate of the cross at Mount Soledad, it is only fair to also remove these two famous religious symbols. Consequently, we must also rename the very city we live in, along with hundreds of other cities in the United States, for they are named after saints. We believe that the First Amendment advocates and ensures us religious freedom, and we believe this is the only interpretation that can be fully used to respect the presence of religious symbols of more than one denomination throughout our great nation. This battle has been played out in the courtroom for years, and much like the symbol that is in question, it also comes down to a difference in interpretation, whether it be in the laws that the plaintiff accuses the defendant of breaking, or the meaning of the cross itself. The commemoration of one battle has led to another, and to discard the structure that instigated this quarrel would be to rip a page of history out of its binding. What we propose is to create another adjoining memorial, an artistic piece capturing the emotional upheaval caused by this event, branded with the plaque celebrating the beliefs and arguments of both sides. We live and will always live in a society of opposing viewpoints, and rather than purging our public forums of one side in order to satisfy another, why not capture the fervor that has pushed us to try to make a change, to serve a point of inspiration for others? In the end, not to promote their validity, but to make their place in history.
In the following, I will show how the history of the cross since 1913 and of the subsequent memorial is a shameful history of the discrimination and segregation that was administered in this city. This is why we favor the removing of the cross from Mount Soledad. We are obviously in accordance with the court's interpretation, the First Amendment, and its presentation. We want to take that further and show that in addition to its illegality, this cross stands for a shameful history of American society. The cross was erected at the time in which La Jolla and the San Diego area was heavily discriminatory against minorities. Until the 1970s, there was residential segregation. In the earlier part of the century, in 1913, a dominant Christian community held the majority of the population, accounting for 90%, as well as 7% for African Americans and 3% for Hispanics. Also in 1913, the cross atop Mount Soledad, public land, was first erected. In 1916, the city of San Diego made the 750-piece acre of land the Mount Soledad Natural Park. However, with the cross still in place, it clearly favored those of religion faith, indirectly showing preference over other visitors. Perhaps a Christian's park would have been more appropriate in allowing public land to administer the representation of a single dominant religion. The localism we find at this date and until recent times was the result of the unfair treatment to other religions and races that tried to move to San Diego. This would allow San Diegans to perceive the cross atop the mountain as a community representation where all were satisfied by its presence. Racial discrimination through segregation is historically documented and prominent in the city of San Diego, as in the 1930s in the town of Lemon Grove and the Lemon Grove Grammar School. Of its 169 students, 75 students were of Mexican descent. The school doors would suddenly refuse entrance to all 75 Mexican students. The Mexican parents, through the Mexican consulate, had to create a separate school for their children. This separation mirrors the implications that a cross atop public land has, that Christians are number one in this city, and moreover, they will be treated as such. African Americans were also unwelcome to take social positions of office as well as own property within the city. The cross continued to stand tall unconstitutionally through all of this. San Diego also hosted the most active branch of anti-Semitism movement whose stated goal was to remove Jews from public office, to overthrow government led by Jews and communists, and to establish a Christian commonwealth. The Revelle branch of UCSD, headed by Roger Revelle, recognized the inability of Jewish professors to find housing to be able to move for work. The memorial was a shameful attempt afterwards to perpetuate the existence of the cross in a context of the continuing discrimination. In 1954, the city of San Diego made the mistake of granting the Soledad Memorial Association the permission to construct a memorial atop Mount Soledad while maintaining the cross. The association claims that it was strictly a memorial and nothing more. Once again, though, the Constitution was being ignored and the cross was stubbornly kept intact regardless of the diversity of religion among veterans and the actual cause of the memorial. It was, after all, not Christians who fought in World War II and the Korean War, it was all Americans. Afterwards, the engineering of a bidding for the land atop Mount Soledad was unfair and displayed the same elements of discrimination that were pervasive before. The association, in attempting to claim private ownership of the land, was included in engineered bidding so that the winning bidder would be obligated to keep the cross while also being provided the money to fund further construction. This construction will be to clarify the symbol of the cross as not being solely religious, rather a universal symbol of self-sacrifice. Clearly, however, this is biased and presumptuous to claim that the cross will stand to those who view it from a distance as a visitor, a veteran, or someone not of Christian faith. The way in which the memorial was set up benefited the upper class and continued to perpetuate further the discrimination of resident classes in San Diego. When the memorial is finally and supposedly legitimate, or somewhat, it becomes a business that sells plaques at $600 to $1,600 a piece, once again immediately distinguishing those wealthy enough to afford the representation of loved ones from those who were less fortunate. The manner in which the memorial was constructed placed the memorial as a pretext to the cross that was not part of the memorial to begin with. In conclusion, the cross should go, the memorial should go, and the park should be reinstated. Historically, the cross was illegal and became tainted with the unequal treatment of all other religions and races. As the cross was continually battled over, the attempts to save the cross also neglected the shameful representation of the veterans who are not part of the initial cross, and by continuously placing the memorial in clearly second best physical presentation. With all this in mind, the Mount Soledad Memorial Association should lose ownership of the land and get its 1,006 $106,000 refunded so that it can pay for the removal of the cross. Moreover, the owners of the plaques must be refunded their money. Once the cross is removed and the rights to the land are placed back in the equal right of all San Diegans, so too must the memorial be removed. If the cross is removed and is at fault for the pretenses it was used under and its unconstitutional presence, then so is the legitimacy of the memorial by the association that owns its construction. The taint of everything but a memorial lies on this memorial. The memorial deserves to be reconstructed, and all veterans deserve to be honored without being under one prominent religious symbol. And finally, the Christian faith too deserves to be removed from all the negative connotation so as to regain the pure symbol it seeks to be, while being within the appropriate location. I propose a Mount Soledad Park as it naturally and equally was before 1913, a park where we can all unite to view the multicultural city of San Diego and discuss our beliefs and enjoy the company of fellow San Diegans, the view and the sunlight alone. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Teresa Mendoza. I work for the law offices of Charles Lamandry. Mr. Lamandry and I are associated with the Thomas More Law Center, which is a public interest law firm that gets involved in cases involving religious liberty issues. We first got involved in this case about 2 years ago. At that time, maybe a little less than 2 years ago, at that time we heard that there was a possibility that the litigation involving the Mount Soledad Cross was going to settle, and that the settlement would involve removing the cross from the memorial. Because we don't believe that the cross as part of the memorial is unconstitutional, we didn't want that settlement to happen. So we contacted Representative Duncan Hunter, who's one of the local congressmen here in San Diego County, and he sponsored a provision in a bill that made the memorial a national veterans memorial. It's on the Registry of National Memorials now. And that bill also authorized the Department of the Interior to accept a donation of the memorial property. A few months later, the City Council, in response to that law, debated the issue and voted against donating the memorial property to the federal government, to the Department of the Interior. At that time, there was kind of a spontaneous grassroots movement that sprang up and undertook what they call a Referendum Petition, which is a legal mechanism by which the citizens can petition the City Council to either reverse its action or submit the matter to the voters. And the group that sprang up called itself San Diegans for the Mount Soledad National War Memorial. And because Mr. Lamandry and I had been involved before, they invited us to work with them. And we've been representing them and working with them ever since. The referendum petition led to a ballot measure that we call Proposition A, which in July of 2005 was voted on by the voters of San Diego, and pursuant to that, they voted to donate the memorial property to the Department of the Interior, and that measure passed by a margin of 76%. At that time, Mr. Paulson and his attorney, Mr. Mcelroy, Mr. Paulson is the plaintiff in the underlying lawsuit, and they filed a challenge to Proposition A in state court, and the state court judge found that Proposition A was unconstitutional under the California Constitution. That holding is now on appeal. The City of San Diego has appealed, and we've appealed on behalf of San Diegans for the Mount Soledad National War Memorial. So that's kind of the status of the legal part of the case on the state side. Meanwhile, I should finish that up. The original case was pending in federal court, and just on May 3rd, the federal court issued an order enforcing the injunction that it had first issued back in 1991, and the injunction says that the City of San Diego cannot permanently display the cross on city property. And So the judge gave the city 90 days from May 3rd to remove the cross or start paying a fine of $5,000. So right now that the issue of whether or not that order is going to be appealed is still being decided. So that's kind of the legal background, or I should say the background of the litigation. I want to just briefly explain why the Thomas More Law Center, Mr. Lamandry and I are involved, because there's kind of very often a very basic misunderstanding, and I see it reflected a lot in the press. There was an editorial in the Union Tribune a couple of weeks ago, and even in the poll that the Union Tribune is taking, that kind of presupposes that the cross, because it's a religious symbol on government property, necessarily is unconstitutional. And that's just not true. So this isn't a case of a bunch of religious fanatics who are trying to cram their beliefs down everybody else's throats despite the Constitution. This is a case of people who feel very strongly about the cross as not only a religious symbol, but a San Diego landmark that has been there since 1954, that particular cross, and other crosses since 1913. And they firmly believe that the display of this particular cross is not unconstitutional. And let me just briefly explain the legal rationale for that. The Constitution of the United States permits acknowledgement and even accommodation of religion and religious belief. And when it comes to the government display of religious symbols, every display has to be judged on its own merits. Everyone is different, and the details are different, and the details have to be analyzed to determine whether or not the display is constitutional. There's a couple of different tests that are actually several different tests that the courts apply to determine whether a religious display is constitutional. And one is, it's named after a case, Lemon v. Kurtz, so it's called the Lemon Test, and basically the idea is to look at the display and determine, is the government purpose in displaying this particular religious symbol wholly motivated by religion or religious motives? And would a reasonable observer who's reasonably informed about the history and the context of that particular display, would they find that display to be an endorsement of religion by the government? Some of the factors that the courts look at when they're determining what the reasonable observer would conclude include duration. For example, this cross has been on display since 1954, and it was never challenged until 1989. So it was there for a long time. And even Justice Breyer, who tends to be on the liberal side of the justices on the Supreme Court, in a recent case involving the display of the Ten Commandments, said the fact that the Ten Commandments display at issue in that case had been on display for some 40 years without anyone complaining about it, to him was indicative that there wasn't any, that the general public did not perceive that display to be a government endorsement of religion, but rather they understood it to be part of a cultural and historical display. And that's the same thing we have here. The cross was up there since 1954. It was dedicated as a veterans memorial. And even though it is also a religious symbol, it was never challenged for over 35 years. Another factor that the courts look at is location and how close the religious display is to government buildings. In this case, the cross is nowhere near any government buildings. And while it is on city property, you don't necessarily know that unless you're up at the park itself, because it is a city park. The people who are, the hundreds of thousands of people who are driving up and down Interstate 5 every day, and if they happen to see the cross, they have no way of knowing whether or not that cross is on city property. As far as they know, it could be on church property. So there's no reason to believe that just because they see it, they think, oh my gosh, my civil rights are being violated by this city of San Diego endorsing religion, especially the Christian religion. As a matter of fact, I just want to say with respect to that argument, I lived in San Diego for 20 years, driving up and down 5 about 1 million times, and I never once noticed the cross until someone pointed it out to me last year. Another factor that the courts look at is the sponsorship of the display. In this case, the cross was not even put up by the city of San Diego. It's not publicly sponsored. The cross was constructed by the Mount Soledad Memorial Association. It's been maintained by the association, and the association has built all of the other improvements, including the walls and the plaques and all the other things that are now part of that memorial. Finally, the courts look at the entire context of the religious display. You can't just look at one religious symbol and say, oh, it's religious, because then anything and everything that had any religious component would be unconstitutional, including our own state constitution, with the preamble of which begins acknowledging and thanking God. So here we have the cross as the centerpiece of a memorial that includes these 6 large walls and all of the plaques and the flagpole and the bollards and the brick pavers. So in context, the reasonable person, going back to what we were saying, the reasonable person test, couldn't reasonably perceive this particular cross to be an endorsement of Christianity by the city of San Diego. If you take into account all of these factors and the entire context and the history of this memorial, clearly what we have here is a veterans memorial that has a cross as its centerpiece. I said there were several different kinds of tests that the courts apply to determine whether or not a religious symbol display is constitutional or not. Recently, the court, when it was the U.S. Supreme Court, when it was analyzing a Ten Commandments display, pointed out that the test that I just described, the Lemon test, is not necessarily that helpful when it comes to just a passive display of a religious symbol, as opposed to some other more proactive government action. In that case, they said, we have to analyze this religious symbol in view of the nature of the monument and our nation's history. So what we need to do is take the memorial, take into account the nature of the monument and its status as a fully integrated, multifaceted, world-class memorial. And we have to also consider the history of memorials in general. And we have to remember, this is a memorial to our military servicemen and women. And the military, when we look at this just in the whole context and history, the military is just replete with religious symbolism. And that's very appropriate, because part of military service is being prepared to exercise that most basic of religious principles, which is self-sacrifice. The cross is a universal symbol of self-sacrifice, and a monument with a cross on it is a particularly appropriate one to memorialize veterans and our nation's war dead. And moreover, a cross also gives comfort to the people who are left behind, and it gives meaning and purpose. And it would be impossible to design a memorial that would perfectly represent every single person that it's designed to honor. But that's no reason to reduce a memorial to its most common denominator, to take away that symbol of the cross, which is a symbol of self-sacrifice and a symbol of hope and a comfort to the people who visit it. So basically, our position is that when you apply all of the factors that go into determining whether the government's display of a religious symbol is constitutional or not, the Mount Soledad Cross clearly is constitutional because of its status as a part of a bona fide veterans memorial. It has a legitimate secular purpose, and the government is not running afoul of the United States Constitution. And I'll just add that this case, thus far, has been decided under the California Constitution. The California Constitution includes a couple of religion clauses. One of them is the no preference clause, and one is the no aid clause. The no preference clause provides that the state cannot exhibit either discrimination against or preference toward religion. and that the state cannot establish a religion. So it kind of mirrors the free exercise, no establishment clause of the United States Constitution. And the no aid clause says that that states and the political subdivisions of the state cannot give away or sell property, real or personal property, to aid a religious purpose. As far as the no preference clause of the California Constitution goes, the California Supreme Court has held that when the establishment clause of the United States Constitution is satisfied, so is the no preference clause. So the cross on the Mount, as long as the cross on Mount Soledad satisfies the establishment clause analysis, it should also satisfy the no preference analysis. Plus, other case law in California holds the same kind of analysis of context has to take place. So when you look at that religious displays by the government are permissible in an appropriate cultural, historical, educational context. And here, the cultural context, of course, is the Veterans Memorial. And as far as the no aid clause goes, in this particular case, the no aid clause was only applied to invalidate the sale of the memorial property to the Memorial Association, and that was on the basis that the city agreed to sell the memorial property, but it made a condition of the sale that the buyer had to maintain a veterans memorial on the property, and they could do that by either keeping the cross or replacing it. But the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the sale went through to the Memorial Association, and they intended to keep the cross. At that time, the Ninth Circuit found that sale was an unconstitutional violation of the no aid clause because the city provided a way for a buyer to satisfy the condition for free by keeping the cross, whereas someone who wanted to replace it would have to spend more money to do that. And so they said that kind of an economic incentive to keep the cross was an impermissible aid to religion. And of course, with the status that we have now, the Proposition A is designed to donate the property to the federal government. The federal government can keep the cross or not. There's no economic incentive to do it, and therefore there's no violation of the no aid clause. So I see that my time is up. I hope that I've been able to explain our point of view and our belief that the cross on Mount Soledad in the context of a Veterans Memorial does not violate either the California or United States Constitutions. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Jim Mcelroy. I'm not with the ACLU, although some of my best friends are with the ACLU. I wouldn't necessarily let my daughter marry someone from the ACLU. I think Eunice and Morgan did a great job today. Eunice almost had me convinced, and I'm hiring Morgan to represent our side next time we're in court. I've been working on this case for about 10 years, and it has been a long and arduous road. And I think when I talk to groups like this, instead of standing in front of a judge or a group of judges, there are two ways to talk about this issue. There is the legal significance of the issue, and then there's the old question of why don't we just do what's right? And in this case, coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, the answer is the same, whether you analyze it legally or whether you ask yourself, let's just do what's right. What's the right thing to do in this case? So to look at it from the legal perspective first, as Teresa so aptly pointed out, this whole establishment clause, separation of church and state law, seems to get real fuzzy and complicated. And are we talking about Ten Commandment monuments? Are we talking about crosses? But really, when you boil it all down, especially as it applies to this case, it's really very simple. And one reason we know it's so simple is because for 17 years, every court who has ever looked at this case has come to the same conclusion. Now, that's either a bunch of radical, crazy activist judges, or it's people like Judge Gordon Thompson, who's been handling this case on the federal court for 17 years, who was appointed by Richard Nixon, that extremely radical president we had some years ago, before most of you were born, 35 years ago, who's one of the most well-respected judges in our community, and who I am sure no matter what his decisions are, for me or against me, conscientiously looks at the law to arrive at the right decisions. 11 judges, it's called an en banc panel, all 11 judges from the Ninth Circuit looked at this case. Every final decision on this case has come down exactly the same way. And why is that? Though, those of you who know a little bit about this whole law thing, it's a word called precedent. We look to the Constitution, we interpret the Constitution, but if there's other cases that have already been decided that can help guide us, we look to those cases, especially if they're U.S. Supreme Court cases. In the history of our country, there have been 10 cases that have addressed the issue of Latin crosses on public property, whether it's federal property or city property. Some of those cases, half of them about, involve Latin crosses on property where the allegation is, and I say that for reasons I'll explain, that it's a war memorial. All 10 cases were decided exactly the same way. They all came to the same conclusion. A Latin cross on public property is unconstitutional. Why is it so obvious to all these courts? Why isn't it a little grayer like it is with the Ten Commandments cases? Well, there's one pretty obvious explanation. There are several, but one that I think is pretty obvious. And as Teresa correctly explained to you, we have this essentially two very simple pronged test. What was the government intent or purpose in having this symbol on its property or fighting to keep it? And the second one is, what is the effect or what is the message it conveys? And an example I like to give to people for this one is the "In God We Trust" on our money. Personally, it just doesn't bother me. Because what is the message that's being sent? When I hand $5 to that guy across the bar, I'm saying, give me a pint of beer. That's what that $5 says to him. Give this guy a pint of beer and his change, if he's buying cheap enough beer. And when I get that change, I'm not saying, oh my goodness, my government is endorsing Christianity. That's not the message that's conveyed by our money. And also notice a point that's been somewhat important to our courts. Money talks about God, as do the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments monuments are recognized by more than one religion. God is a fairly generic concept that almost all religions endorse in one form or another. A Latin cross, on the other hand, is the preeminent symbol of Christianity. It is a beautiful, terrific, wonderful symbol that everyone recognized as the crux of the Christian religion is the crucifixion and resurrection. People wear it around their necks, and everybody knows what it means. It's unmistakable. Anyone who drives down Freeway 5 who looks at that doesn't think war memorial. They think there's a Christian cross. As well they should. So the courts have no trouble saying, what message is being conveyed? Does this guy want to buy a beer with a cross? No. Is this talking about all religions generically? Are we honoring all religions with this symbol? No. We are honoring only one religion. It happens to be the predominant religion in this country. That's why I think the Taliban example is so interesting. I think it so strongly supports the arguments we make. When the dominant government and the dominant religion starts destroying the religious symbols of the minority, you have some serious problems. That's why our government is so wonderful and so unique in the way we have set our country up. Our government does not prefer one religion over another. If there's anything you can take away from the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution or the California Constitution, as it applies to this case, it doesn't answer all questions, but this case, it answers so clearly and easily. And it's a message that resonates with most Americans. Our government does not prefer one religion over others. It doesn't prefer one race over others. It doesn't erect a monument to a white man on top of Mount Soledad because, they're the dominant race in this country. It doesn't erect crosses to promote one religion over all others and have all taxpayers support that monument despite what their religion may be. And I mentioned that allegedly war memorials, because clearly there's a war memorial up there now, but there wasn't when this cross was erected. Interestingly, as the court has pointed out, this cross was erected and dedicated on Easter Sunday. And the court pointed out that Memorial Day is 6 weeks after Easter Sunday. But it was erected on Easter Sunday because it is predominantly and primarily a religious symbol. Anyone who denies that is just not speaking very logically or making much sense. Its predominant message is a religious one. That's why people are fighting so hard to save it. Teresa, for instance, is a very great lawyer, and her associate, Mr. Lamandry, has fought very, very hard to keep this symbol. They're working for an organization called the Thomas More Law Center, who fights very hard in these kinds of cases. But it's not an organization that promotes religious diversity or religious freedom in our country. Their mission statement is to protect Christians and Christianity in the public square. Absolutely nothing wrong with that for a private organization. Everything in the world wrong with it if you're a governmental entity, because you are saying, we prefer the Christian religion over all others. And that our government cannot do, has never been able to do, never should be able to do. When we move from the law to what's the right thing to do, it's even more important today when we see what's going on with the Taliban in Afghanistan and Iraq, and most of the battles that are going on in this world today have religions fighting against religions. We are becoming religiously a much more diverse country every single day. I do an awful lot of civil rights work as well, and I tell people we are becoming a racially more diverse country every single day. And that's why tolerance and acceptance are so important in our community. And that's why, if anything, our government should be opening its arms to everyone, to all religions, and those of no religion, and to all races. And when you put a 40-foot, 20-ton symbol for one religion in preference of all other religions, you are sending the wrong message. And when you spend 17 years of taxpayers' money fighting, kicking, and screaming to protect this religious symbol. By the way, there was no war memorial up there until about 5 years ago. It was just a cross. But governmental entities have a tendency to call it a war memorial when they're trying to protect a cross because that's their only defense. So the Memorial Association spent $1 million up there creating a war memorial around the cross. And the courts have said initially, before that was built, it doesn't look like a war memorial to us. You have Sunday Easter services up there every year. It was called the Easter Cross for years and years in San Diego. People get baptized up there. How many people get baptized at a war memorial? There are Christian weddings up there. It clearly is a religious symbol, so it doesn't really look like a war memorial. But every court, including the en banc, those 11 judges, after that $1 million was spent, and the parties, the city and the Memorial Association stood in front of those 11 judges and said, it's not a religious symbol anymore, it's a war memorial. The court said, okay, it's a war memorial, but it's a sectarian war memorial as long as the cross is there. And you're adding insult to injury. You are saying to all those people who fought and died for this country that are not Christians, when Ms. Mendoza says it's a universal symbol of sacrifice, tell that to some Jewish veterans who lost their family members fighting for this war. Do they look to the Christian cross as their universal symbol for suffering? I don't think so. Nor do any other religions. It's a symbol of Christianity. I don't want to talk too long because I think it would be much more fun to entertain questions. So let's do that if we can.
Hi, my name is David Pat. I have a question. One of the points brought up by Eunice was the fact that there are other religious symbols on public land. Do any of you think it's unfair that most cases are targeting Christian symbols on public land and that there's really not many cases against other, say like Buddhist symbols or like Muslim symbols?
I personally am not aware of any other symbols in San Diego that send a message that the government promotes that symbol. I know we have a cultural exchange relationship with a Japanese city, I think it's a Japanese city, which has this symbol out on Point Loma. I don't think that most observers perceive it as a religious symbol. I think they perceive it as a cultural symbol. So I don't think there really are any other symbols in San Diego that communicate a preference for religion.
The reason that the Thomas More Law Center concentrates on protecting the religious liberties of Christians is that it's the Christian symbols that tend to be under attack. There's a small minority that wants to remove any acknowledgement of God or religion from public property. And most of those acknowledgments tend to be either the kind of generic ones that the monotheistic religions all relate to, the idea of God, and then some of them have to do specifically with the Christian religion, nativity scenes and crosses, and those are the ones that tend to come under attack. So that's why we're concentrating on protecting and preserving those symbols to the extent that they do meet the tests for constitutionality.
Are there laws that permit crosses in war memorials? Why does it make a difference if this is a war memorial? And also, a secondary question, which I think it's a question in many people's mind, is the issue of the land. So if the cross goes, the land goes back to the city, therefore the memorial should go too.
Well, I don't think the memorial should go. I don't think there's anything wrong with the memorial, and I don't think there's anything wrong with religious symbols on the plaques at the memorial, just like I don't think there's anything wrong at Arlington Cemetery, which is federal land, with individual families placing crosses on their loved ones' graves. There are also some 2,500 Stars of David at Arlington Cemetery. So when it's the individual making the selection instead of the government, then I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I'm concerned about the war memorial because unfortunately the Mount Soledad Memorial people were told by the city that this litigation was over, go ahead and spend your $1 million. And I have to disagree with my friend here. I think it's a beautiful memorial. I don't think there's anything wrong with the war memorial. The only problem is it's sending the wrong signal that, as the courts have repeatedly said, this is just not me, but every court who has heard that argument has said, you are only honoring Christian veterans. And that is the government showing preference for one religion over another. So if the cross moves, the problem is solved. As Teresa pointed out, we have this reasonable observer standard. But the courts have said the reasonable observer is one who knows the history and the context. That doesn't mean we all know that. Some of us are not reasonable people. But the court assumes that the reasonable person knows that that cross is on city land. In this city, a 17-year legal battle, you would have to be living in a closet for the last 10 years to not know it's on city land. And when it moves, the court assumes the reasonable observer understands that it is on private land when it's sitting at the church 1,000 yards away.
The reason that we talk about the war memorial or veterans memorial is that it goes to the whole idea of the context of the display of the religious symbol, which in this case is a cross. In context, is the religious symbol displayed to endorse or promote one religion over another religion, or in context, does it have a legitimate secular purpose? If it does have a legitimate secular purpose, then it's constitutional. In this case, the cross was dedicated as a war memorial. It's true, Judge Thompson doubted that it really was a memorial, and that, of course, was his his right to do, but now there isn't any doubt that what we have up there is a war memorial, and the other elements of the memorial are built around the centerpiece cross. So that's the significance of the talking about it in the context of being a memorial. I don't know what to say about the ownership of the land issue.
No, but if I could just skip to one other thing that was addressed earlier that might be interesting to give some consideration to, and that is this whole issue of when you have 76% of the people who want something, shouldn't that be respected and honored? And that makes a lot of sense to me. We are, after all, a democracy. But there's one place in particular where that should not be considered, and that is in respecting our fundamental constitutional rights that are guaranteed to us. And the reason we have those guarantees is because our forefathers were very concerned about the whim of the government and protecting us against government tyranny and protecting us against political caprice or the whim or the flavor of the month. So for an analogy, one I often use, if you were back in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1950s and the city council decided to put it to a vote whether Rosa Parks should be able to sit on the front of the bus or not, you know how that vote would have gone. Rosa would have stayed on the back of the bus. It takes our courts to protect those precious, fundamental constitutional rights for us. Your right to free speech can't be taken away because a majority of the people don't like what you have to say and they vote to shut you up. That right is guaranteed to you, and our courts are there to protect that right. I would also say that the 76% is somewhat disingenuous to suggest that this had that kind of support in this context. 6 months before that vote was taken, there was a vote on Proposition K. 190,000 people voted yes for Prop A. 250,000 people voted no on Prop K. Now, the other side says they got confused, but yet they want to hold Prop A up as being so important, and the voters decided this, and we can't ignore it, but we should ignore what they decided in Prop K because they're too stupid to read the ballot argument. I don't think that's true. I wrote the ballot argument, and while I can say some pretty stupid things and write some pretty stupid things, one of the things it said was, if you vote no, the cross will be moved. So I don't know what necessarily motivates people to vote how, but I can tell you that what we said in Proposition K is the same thing they said in Proposition A, and that is, this will end the litigation. We were correct, they weren't. I think that resonates with a lot of San Diegans after 17 years, whether they want the cross up there or they don't want the cross up there. I think they want this litigation to end.
I have a question to pose to you. In the nature of our debate and discussion in class, whether or not, or would the solution to this situation be such that it exchanges the cross as part of the memorial for one that recognizes and hosts all kinds of religions, or religion in a more generic sense?
Another thing we didn't get a chance to talk about today that angers me a little bit is we actually had a settlement of this case. After the en banc decision in 2002, I sat down with the city attorney's office and the Mount Soledad Association. We entered into a settlement to move the cross to a nearby church. When we were discussing that, all sorts of solutions came up, all sorts of suggestions, like, what if we put other comparable symbols up there? Well, yeah, but the court says it's got to be comparable. So do you want to put a 40-foot, 20-ton Star of David? Because then the Scientologists are going to want a 40-foot statue of L. Ron Hubbard. You know, there's 120 religions practiced in this country, so that wasn't really feasible, and you'd have to put up a symbol for those that are not religious. So when we entered into this settlement, the Memorial Association, in fact, who used to fight me on this case for about 8 years, and then finally said, okay, we understand now. We understand the court's rulings. We're not a religious organization. We're a veterans organization. Let's move the cross, and we will have a design team come in and design a memorial in its place that will be some universal symbol that will recognize and honor all of the war dead. And if you will notice again how clear-cut this question is, every little town in this country's got a war memorial. I'm on the East Coast, and I see these, in some of these small towns, I see Revolutionary War memorials, and they got names of people who actually died in the Revolutionary War, and I'm from the Midwest where we had a lot of civil rights memorials. Washington, D.C., there's a memorial to every single war we've ever been in. Not one of them feature a predominant cross, because I think it's so obvious that it is an insult to those who died for our freedoms who are not Christians. Many of them have various religious symbols honoring the individual person that's dead. So yes, that subject has been addressed, and that's what the Memorial Association would like to do. When the litigation started again and the settlement didn't go through, they tabled the design team, but if and when the cross gets moved, they'd like to see a universal symbol up there.
The Memorial Association, owns and built and maintains the memorial, including the cross. And that's one of the reasons that we think it satisfies the test for being constitutional, is it's sponsored by a private entity. So, what they do with the memorial, I can't really speak to, except all I can say is that the reason that we got involved is that we do not believe that the cross as part of this Veterans Memorial is unconstitutional. And I would just like to point out that there are many veterans and war memorials that do include crosses. There's one in the town square in Taos, New Mexico. There are crosses on display in memorial crosses in Arlington National Cemetery. I don't know if any of you watch The Amazing Race, but a few weeks ago, the contestants all had to go to Australia, to Perth, Australia, and they had to find a certain war memorial. And I jokingly said to my husband, gee, I wonder if there's going to be a cross on that memorial. And the next thing you know, they show the memorial, and it's this very tall, tens of feet tall obelisk, and right on the front of it is a big cross. So I looked it up on the internet, and it's dedicated to the Australian soldiers and sailors for several different wars, and it's not specific to just Christians. So there are lots, of war memorials that do feature crosses, and that's an appropriate symbol of self-sacrifice.
I just had a question about talking about the cross and how it's only representative of Christians as far as the soldiers are concerned. What about on the individual plaques? They have like the Star of David on some of them, and other religious symbols on the plaques themselves, identifying that particular soldier with a specific religion. So I guess like how does that play into the whole thing?
We don't think that the cross, as part of a memorial, memorializes only Christians. And apparently there are non-Christian veterans and families of those who lost their lives in war who agree with us, because as pointed out, some of these plaques do feature Stars of David, and I would presume that some of the veterans and the war dead who are memorialized at Mount Soledad did not necessarily have a religious belief at all. So, but that didn't stop their families or from purchasing these plaques to memorialize them at this particular memorial.
I'm not really a guy who buys into a lot of conspiracy theories, but when I first heard that there were a couple of Star of David plaques up there, I thought, I wonder how hard they had to dig around to find a couple of Jewish war veterans who would have their plaques put up there, because I've heard from several Jewish groups I spoke to. A guy told me the other day, a lawyer, that his father was a Jewish war veteran, and he was approached and asked to put a Star of David up there for his father, and he looked at me and said, why would I put a Star of David under a 40-foot cross? But more specifically, in answer to your question about the legal significance of that, whether they went out and got a couple of guys' families to put Star of Davids up there or they didn't, they sure did make a big argument out of it in front of the court. And the court essentially said, are you kidding me? You got a 6-inch plaque and a 40-foot, 20-ton cross. 300,000 people see the cross from the freeway every day. Nobody sees the plaque. So there's a couple of constitutional issues. Again, I see it like Arlington. If the individual family member wants to use some religious symbol on a piece of public property where there is some sort of memorial, particularly in a cemetery, I have no problem with that. That's the individual sending a message that this is the religion that's near and dear to us and means something to us. It's not the government. Certainly a 6-inch plaque does not diminish the religious message that's sent by the 40-foot cross.
Thank you very much, everybody.